The forest was alive with light. Neon colors pulsed softly from the trees and plants, casting an eerie glow over the battlefield. The air buzzed with energy, not just from the strange alien vegetation, but from the chaos of war. Explosions echoed in the distance, and the sharp crack of gunfire filled the night. The ground was littered with debris, broken weapons, pieces of armor, and the remains of both human and alien soldiers. Ethan Cole lay behind a fallen tree, his breath shallow and uneven. His leg throbbed with pain, the jagged piece of shrapnel embedded deep into his calf, making every movement unbearable. He clenched his teeth and tried to focus. The wound was bad, but it wasn't the worst he'd ever had. What worried him more was the fact that he was out of ammunition. His rifle, once his most trusted companion, now felt useless in his hands. He glanced at it bitterly before setting it aside. Around him, the sounds of battle were dying down. The humans had been pushed back, their lines broken by the relentless assault of the Vryn. Ethan knew the odds weren't good. The Vryn were faster, stronger, and better equipped than any enemy humanity had faced before. They moved like shadows, their sleek, insect-like bodies blending seamlessly into the environment. And they were ruthless. If you weren't quick enough, you didn't stand a chance. Ethan shifted slightly, wincing as the movement sent fresh waves of pain through his leg. He needed to think. Staying here wasn't an option. Sooner or later, the Vryn would come looking for survivors, and when they found him, he wouldn't last long. But moving wasn't easy either. His injured leg made it almost impossible to walk, let alone run. He cursed under his breath and scanned the area again, hoping for some sign of help. It didn't take long for the Vryn to appear. 3 of them emerged from the glowing underbrush, their movements fluid and silent. Their eyes glowed faintly, scanning the area with predatory precision. Ethan froze, holding his breath. He knew they hadn't seen him yet, but it was only a matter of time. Slowly, he reached for the knife strapped to his belt. It wasn't much, but it was all he had left. One of the Vryn crouched low, its head tilting as it sniffed the air. Its claws flexed reflexively, ready to strike. Ethan tightened his grip on the knife, preparing himself for what was coming next. But then something unexpected happened. The Vryn commander stepped forward, his voice a series of guttural clicks and hisses that Ethan couldn't understand. Whatever he said, it made the others stop. They hesitated, glancing at each other before retreating back into the forest. Ethan blinked in confusion. Had they really just left him there? He watched as their forms disappeared into the neon-lit trees, leaving him alone once again. For a moment, he thought about calling out, about trying to get their attention so they could finish the job. But something stopped him. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was instinct, but he stayed quiet, waiting until he was sure they were gone. He didn't know why they had spared him, but he wasn't going to waste the opportunity. Carefully, he began to assess his situation. His leg was still bleeding, but the flow had slowed down. That was something, at least. He tore a strip of fabric from his sleeve and tied it tightly around the wound, gritting his teeth against the pain. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it would have to do for now. Next, he turned his attention to his surroundings. The fallen tree he was hiding behind was large enough to provide decent cover, but it wouldn't protect him forever. He needed to find a way to defend himself, even without ammunition. His eyes darted around, searching for anything useful. Nearby, he spotted a piece of twisted metal, a fragment of some destroyed weapon. It was sharp, jagged, and roughly the size of his hand. Not ideal, but it might work as a makeshift weapon. As he worked, Ethan's mind raced. He thought about Rachel, the medic who had patched him up after countless battles. She was tough, smart, and fiercely loyal. If anyone could find him in this mess, it was her. He hoped she was safe wherever she was. He also thought about Captain Drake, the man leading their forces. Drake was a good leader, but even he couldn't hold the line forever against the Vryn. If things didn't change soon, the entire operation would collapse. The sound of distant footsteps pulled Ethan out of his thoughts. He tensed, gripping the shard of metal tightly. Whoever or whatever it was getting closer. He pressed himself flat against the ground, trying to make himself as small as possible. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the soft rustle of leaves. Then suddenly a figure emerged from the trees. It wasn't a Vryn. "Ethan," the figure whispered urgently. It was Rachel. Her face was streaked with dirt, and her uniform was torn, but she looked otherwise unharmed. Relief washed over Ethan as he saw her. He opened his mouth to respond, but she quickly shushed him, crouching beside him. "You're lucky I found you," she said, her voice low. "I've been tracking your signal for hours." "I'm fine," Ethan muttered, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Just a scratch." Rachel rolled her eyes but didn't argue. Instead, she pulled a medkit from her pack and began tending to his wound. "Hold still," she ordered. "This is going to hurt." Ethan bit back a groan as she cleaned the injury and applied a fresh bandage. The pain was intense, but he endured it without complaint. Once she was done, Rachel sat back on her heels, studying him critically. "We need to move," she said finally. "If the Vryn come back, we won't stand a chance." Ethan nodded. "Agreed. But my leg isn't exactly cooperative right now." Rachel frowned, considering their options. "We'll figure something out. First, though, we need to gather whatever supplies we can. Can you walk at all?" Ethan tested his leg cautiously, wincing as he put weight on it. "A little," he admitted, "but not far." "That's okay," Rachel replied. "We'll take it slow. Just stay close to me and keep that piece of metal handy. We might need it." Together, they began scavenging the area. Ethan found a few more shards of metal and some elastic fibers from a discarded piece of equipment. With Rachel's help, he fashioned a crude sling for his improvised weapon. It wasn't much, but it gave him a sense of security. As they worked, Rachel kept watch, her eyes constantly scanning the forest for signs of danger. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked quietly. "The Vryn?" Ethan shrugged. "Probably. They're not stupid. Leaving me alive doesn't mean they've forgotten about me." Rachel nodded, her expression grim. "Then we'd better be ready." By the time they finished gathering supplies, the forest had grown eerily quiet. The sounds of battle had faded completely, replaced by an unsettling stillness. Ethan and Rachel exchanged a glance, both sensing that something was wrong. "Let's go," Rachel said, helping Ethan to his feet. "We can't stay here." Ethan nodded, leaning heavily on her shoulder as they began to move. Every step sent jolts of pain through his leg, but he forced himself to keep going. They didn't have a choice. Behind them, the neon lights of the forest flickered faintly, casting long shadows across the ground. Neither of them noticed the pair of glowing eyes watching from the darkness. The forest seemed quieter now, but Ethan knew better than to trust the silence. Every step he took sent a sharp stab of pain through his injured leg, and Rachel's steady arm around his waist was the only thing keeping him upright. They moved, slowly, carefully, trying to stay hidden in the shadows of the glowing trees. The neon lights that had once made the forest seem alive now felt like spotlights, exposing them to anyone, or anything, watching. Rachel kept glancing over her shoulder, her hand resting on the grip of her sidearm. She didn't say much, but Ethan could see the tension in her face. Her jaw was tight and her eyes darted constantly, scanning for threats. "We're not safe yet," she muttered under her breath as they reached a cluster of thick bushes. "Let's rest here for a minute." Ethan nodded gratefully and lowered himself to the ground, wincing as his leg brushed against a rock. He leaned back against a tree trunk, taking slow, deep breaths to steady himself. The pain was bad, but it wasn't the worst part. What really bothered him was the feeling of being useless. He was a sniper, someone who thrived on precision and stealth. Now he couldn't even walk without help. Rachel crouched beside him, pulling out her scanner. The small device hummed softly as she checked their surroundings. "No immediate signs of Vryn," she said after a moment. "But we need to keep moving if they figure out where we are." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Ethan knew what she meant. The Vryn weren't known for mercy. If they caught up to him and Rachel, it wouldn't end well. Still, there was something strange about how they had left him alive earlier. It wasn't like them to show restraint, especially when they were winning. Why do you think they let me live? Ethan asked, breaking the silence. Rachel frowned, thinking. Maybe they thought you were already dead, she suggested. Or maybe they wanted to save you for later. Torture, interrogation, whatever. Ethan shook his head. They're smarter than that. Leaving me alive doesn't make sense unless... He trailed off, his brow furrowing as a thought occurred to him. Unless what? Rachel prompted. Unless they think I'm not a threat anymore, Ethan said slowly. They saw me go down, saw I was out of ammo. Maybe they figured I wasn't worth the effort. Rachel gave him a skeptical look. You're always a threat, Ethan, you know that as well as I do. Ethan managed a faint smile. Thanks for the vote of confidence. But if they underestimated me, maybe we can use that to our advantage. Rachel raised an eyebrow. What do you have in mind? Ethan glanced around, his sharp eyes picking out details in the dim light. Traps, he said simply. If we can rig some kind of defense, we might be able to slow them down, or at least buy us some time. Rachel considered this for a moment before nodding. It's risky, but it could work. Let's see what we've got. They began searching the area again, looking for anything they could use. Ethan's hands worked quickly, his fingers nimble, despite the pain in his leg. He used the shards of metal he'd collected earlier, along with some elastic fibers from his gear, to create crude traps. Some were designed to trip or ensnare, while others were rigged to make noise, drawing attention away from their position. Rachel helped wherever she could, though her focus remained on keeping watch. Do you hear that? She whispered suddenly, freezing in place. Ethan stopped what he was doing and listened. At first, he didn't hear anything. Then faintly he picked up the sound of movement, soft footsteps crunching through the underbrush. Someone or something was coming. Get behind the tree, Rachel hissed, pulling her sidearm free. Ethan grabbed his makeshift weapon and limped toward cover, his heart pounding. He pressed himself flat against the trunk, his breathing shallow as he waited. The footsteps grew louder, closer. A shadow moved through the glowing foliage, and then a figure stepped into view. It wasn't a Vryn. It was another human soldier, one of their own. His uniform was torn and his face was pale, but he was alive. Who's there? The man called out, his voice hoarse. Is anyone still alive? Rachel stepped forward cautiously, lowering her weapon. It's okay, she said. We're human. The soldier blinked, relief washing over his face. Thank God, he murmured. I thought I was the only one left. What's your name? Rachel asked. Daniel, the man replied. Private Daniel Hayes. I got separated from my unit during the retreat. Ethan studied him carefully. Daniel looked exhausted, but there was no sign of injury beyond a few scrapes and bruises. Do you know where the others are? Ethan asked. Daniel shook his head. Last I heard, Captain Drake was regrouping at the southern ridge, but the Vryn are everywhere. Getting there won't be easy. We'll manage, Rachel said firmly. For now, stick with us. We're heading that way. Daniel nodded, gratefully, and joined them as they continued moving. With Rachel supporting Ethan and Daniel keeping watch, they formed a small ragtag team. It wasn't much, but it was better than going it alone. As they traveled, Ethan kept an eye on the traps he'd set earlier. He pointed them out to Rachel and Daniel, explaining how they worked. If any Vryn come sniffing around, these should slow them down, he said. Just don't trigger them yourself. Daniel nodded, though he looked uneasy. How many do you think are still out there? He asked. Too many. Ethan replied grimly. But if we're smart, we can even the odds a little. The group pressed on, navigating the dense forest as quietly as possible. The neon lights overhead cast strange patterns on the ground, making it hard to tell where shadows ended and reality began. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made them freeze, their hearts racing as they waited to see if danger would appear. At one point, Rachel stopped abruptly, holding up a hand to signal the others. She crouched low, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the area. Something's wrong, she whispered. Ethan followed her gaze and saw it too. a faint shimmer in the air, almost like heat waves. But it wasn't natural. It was a cloaking device, the kind the Vryn used to hide their movements. "They're here," Ethan said quietly. "Stay down." The three of them huddled together, their weapons ready. The shimmer grew stronger, and then suddenly, two Vryn soldiers materialized from thin air. Their insect-like bodies gleamed in the dim light, and their glowing eyes locked onto the humans instantly. Before anyone could react, the Vryn lunged forward. Rachel fired her sidearm, hitting one of them squarely in the chest. The creature staggered but didn't fall, its claws slashing wildly as it charged. Daniel swung his rifle like a club, striking the second Vryn across the head. It screeched in anger, stumbling backward. Ethan acted quickly, hurling one of his improvised weapons with surprising accuracy. The shard of metal struck the first Vryn in the throat, causing it to collapse with a gurgling cry. The second Vryn turned toward him, its claws raised high. But before it could attack, Rachel fired again, this time aiming for its glowing eyes. The shot connected, and the creature fell, twitching. For a moment there was silence. Then Rachel let out a shaky breath. "That was too close," she said. "No kidding," Daniel muttered, his hands trembling as he lowered his rifle. Ethan didn't say anything. He was already checking the fallen Vryn, searching for anything useful. From one of them, he retrieved a small energy cell, a power source that could be adapted for human equipment. It wasn't much, but it might come in handy later. "We need to keep moving," Rachel said, glancing around nervously. "More will come." They continued on, their pace slower now but no less determined. Ethan's traps had done their job, delaying the Vryn long enough for the group to gain some distance. But he knew it wouldn't last forever. Sooner or later, the enemy would catch up, and when they did, the humans would need every advantage they could get. As they walked, Ethan found himself thinking about the battle ahead. The Vryn were relentless, but they weren't invincible. If they could find a way to strike back, if they could turn the tide even slightly, they might stand a chance, and if anyone could make that happen, it was him. The forest grew darker as they moved deeper into its heart. The neon lights that had once illuminated their path began to dim, casting long shadows across the ground. Ethan limped alongside Rachel, his makeshift weapon clutched tightly in his hand. Daniel followed close behind, his rifle at the ready. None of them spoke much. There was nothing left to say. Every step felt heavier than the last, not just because of exhaustion, but because of the weight of what lay ahead. Ethan's mind raced as he scanned their surroundings. He knew they couldn't keep running forever. Sooner or later, the Vryn would find them again. And when they did, it wouldn't be just two soldiers like before. It would be an entire squad, maybe more. They needed a plan, something smarter than simply trying to outrun their enemies. "We can't stay on the move like this," Ethan said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was low but firm. "We need to set up somewhere defensible." Rachel glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "You're right. We're slowing down too much and your leg isn't getting any better. If we don't find a good spot soon, we'll be sitting ducks." Daniel nodded nervously. "What about those traps you made earlier? Could we use them again?" Ethan considered this for a moment. "Maybe. But setting up traps takes time, and we don't know how much of it we have. What we really need is high ground, a place where we can see them coming and pick them off before they get too close." Rachel frowned. "High ground sounds great, but this forest doesn't exactly have a lot of hills or cliffs." "Not naturally," Ethan replied. "But there are trees." Rachel's eyes widened slightly as she caught his meaning. "You want us to climb?" "It's risky," Ethan admitted. "But if we can get above them, we'll have the advantage. They're fast on the ground, but they're not used to fighting from below." Daniel looked skeptical. "Climbing with all this gear and with your leg won't be easy." "I'll manage," Ethan said firmly. "And even if I can't climb, I can still help from the ground. You two can handle the high positions." Rachel hesitated, weighing the risks. Finally, she nodded. "All right, let's find some sturdy trees and make it happen." They continued moving, searching for the perfect location. After a while, they found a cluster of tall, wide-trunked trees with thick branches that stretched high into the air. The trees were spaced far enough apart to give them clear lines of sight, but close enough to support each other if needed. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best they could hope for. "Here," Ethan said, pointing to one of the larger trees. "This will do." Rachel studied the tree carefully, then turned to Daniel. "You go first. Make sure the branches can hold your weight." Daniel nodded and began climbing, testing each foothold cautiously. Once he reached a stable branch about 20 feet off the ground, he signaled for Rachel to follow. She moved quickly and efficiently, finding her footing with ease. When she was settled, she turned to Ethan. "Your turn," she called down softly. Ethan shook his head. "I'll stay down here. Someone needs to cover you in case they come early." Rachel opened her mouth to argue, but Ethan cut her off. "It's not up for debate. You and Daniel are faster and quieter. Up there, you'll be more useful." Reluctantly, Rachel agreed. "Fine, but if anything happens, you call out immediately. Got it?" "Got it," Ethan replied. With the others positioned, above, Ethan focused on fortifying their position on the ground. Using the materials they'd scavenged earlier, he set up additional traps around the base of the trees. Some were designed to trip or entangle, while others were rigged to create loud noises if triggered. He worked methodically, ignoring the pain in his leg as best he could. As he finished the last trap, a faint sound caught his attention. It was distant but unmistakable, the soft hum of Vryn communication devices. They were coming. Ethan raised his head, scanning the forest. The glow of the neon plants made it hard to see clearly, but he didn't need to. He could feel it, the tension in the air, the sense that danger was closing in. He grabbed his makeshift weapon and pressed himself against the trunk of the tree, waiting. "Rachel," he whispered urgently. "They're here." Above him, Rachel adjusted her grip on her sidearm and peered through the leaves. Daniel did the same, his rifle aimed downward. Both of them stayed silent, their breathing slow and controlled. The Vryn arrived moments later, moving silently through the underbrush. There were 5 of them this time, their sleek bodies blending almost perfectly with the glowing foliage. They spread out, searching systematically for signs of life. One of them stepped directly into one of Ethan's traps, triggering a loud, snapping noise as the elastic fibers tightened around its legs. The creature screeched in anger, thrashing wildly as it tried to free itself. Its companions froze, their glowing eyes darting toward the source of the noise. Ethan seized the opportunity, hurling one of his improvised weapons with deadly accuracy. The shard struck the trapped Vryn in the chest, silencing it instantly. The remaining Vryn reacted quickly, scattering to avoid further traps. 2 of them charged toward Ethan's position, their claws raised high. Ethan braced himself, gripping his weapon tightly as they closed in. Just as they were about to reach him, a shot rang out from above. One of the Vryn collapsed, a clean hole through its glowing eye. Rachel fired again, taking down another before they could react. The last 2 Vryn retreated, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as they had come. For a moment, there was silence. Then Rachel climbed down from her perch, her face pale but determined. "That was too close," she said, helping Ethan to his feet. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Ethan muttered, though his hands were trembling. "Did we get them all?" Daniel slid down from his branch, shaking his head. "No, 2 of them got away." "They'll report back," Rachel said grimly. "We need to move now." Ethan nodded, wincing as he put weight on his injured leg. "Agreed, but first," he turned his attention to the fallen Vryn, searching their bodies for anything useful. From one of them, he retrieved a small device, a portable scanner similar to Rachel's. It wasn't damaged, which meant it might still work. "What's that?" Daniel asked, watching curiously. "A scanner," Ethan replied. "If we're lucky, it'll show us where the Vryn are concentrating their forces." Rachel took the device and activated it, her eyes widening as data appeared on the screen. "It's working," she said. "Looks like they've set up a forward command post about a mile east of here." Ethan frowned. "That explains why. They sent scouts after us. They're planning something big." Then we need to stop them, Rachel said firmly. If we can disrupt their command structure, we might buy Captain Drake enough time to regroup. Ethan nodded slowly. It's risky, but it's our best shot. Can you lead us there? Rachel studied the scanner again, then nodded. I think so. Follow me. With Rachel leading the way, the group set off once more, moving as quietly as possible. Ethan's leg burned with every step, but he pushed through. The pain, focusing on the mission ahead. They couldn't afford to fail, not now. As they traveled, Ethan's mind kept returning to the battle they'd just fought. The Vryn had underestimated them, just as he'd hoped. Their arrogance had cost them dearly, but it wouldn't happen again. Next time, the enemy would come prepared, and in greater numbers. We're going to need more firepower, Ethan said suddenly, breaking the silence. Rachel glanced back at him. What do you mean? These traps and makeshift weapons won't be enough against a full-scale assault, Ethan explained. If we're going to take out their command post, we'll need something bigger. Daniel frowned. Like what? Ethan hesitated, his mind racing. Then slowly a plan began to form. Explosives, he said finally. If we can rig something powerful enough, we can collapse their command post, or at least cause enough chaos to scatter their forces. Rachel's eyes narrowed. Where are we supposed to find explosives out here? Ethan gestured to the scanner in her hand. Their supply lines. If we can intercept one of their patrols, we might be able to steal what we need. Rachel considered this for a moment, then nodded. It's dangerous, but it could work. Let's keep moving. They continued on, their pace slower but no less determined. Ahead of them, the faint glow of the Vryn's command post became visible through the trees. It was guarded, heavily fortified, and surrounded by dozens of soldiers. Taking it down wouldn't be easy, but Ethan knew they didn't have a choice. For humanity's survival, they had to try. The glow of the Vryn command post grew brighter as Ethan, Rachel, and Daniel crept closer. The structure was strange, part alien technology, part scavenged materials from the forest. It pulsed with faint blue light, like a living thing, and was surrounded by a ring of soldiers standing guard. Their insect-like bodies shimmered in the dim illumination, their glowing eyes scanning the area constantly. The humans stayed low, hidden behind a thick cluster of neon-lit bushes. Ethan's leg throbbed painfully, but he ignored it, focusing instead on the task ahead. This is going to be tricky, he whispered, his voice barely audible. They've got eyes everywhere. Rachel nodded, her gaze fixed on the command post. We can't just walk in there, we'll need a distraction. A big one, Daniel added nervously. He glanced at Ethan, then at Rachel. What do we do? Ethan thought for a moment, his sharp mind working quickly. We split up, he said finally. Rachel, you and Daniel take the north side. Try to draw their attention away from the supply lines. I'll head south and see if I can find what we need. Rachel frowned. You're injured, Ethan. You shouldn't go alone. I'll be fine, Ethan replied firmly. Besides, I'm the least likely to get spotted. If they catch me, I can still fight back. You two will have your hands full keeping them distracted. Rachel hesitated but eventually nodded. All right, but be careful. Always, Ethan said with a faint smile. Then, without another word, he slipped into the shadows, moving slowly and deliberately toward the southern edge of the command post. Rachel and Daniel moved in the opposite direction, sticking close to the trees. They stayed low, using the dense foliage as cover. When they reached a position about 50 yards from the northern perimeter, Rachel turned to Daniel. Ready? She asked quietly. Daniel swallowed hard but nodded. Ready. Rachel pulled a small device from her belt, a flare gun loaded with a modified charge. She aimed carefully, then fired. The flare shot into the air, bursting into a bright, blinding light that illuminated the entire area. The Vryn guards immediately reacted, their heads snapping toward the source of the disturbance. Several of them charged toward the flares, landing point, their weapons drawn. That should keep them busy, Rachel muttered. She and Daniel began moving again, circling around to create more noise and confusion. They threw rocks and sticks, anything they could find to make it sound like there were multiple intruders. The Vryn, confused and frustrated, spread out to investigate, leaving gaps in their defenses. Meanwhile, Ethan made his way to the southern side of the command post. He moved cautiously, avoiding open areas and sticking to the shadows. His injured leg slowed him down, but he pressed on, driven by determination. He knew this was their only chance to turn the tide of the battle. As he approached the supply lines, he spotted what he was looking for, a stack of crates marked with alien symbols. He didn't need to understand the language to know what they contained: explosives. The Vryn had brought enough firepower to level an entire base, and now Ethan intended to use it against them. He scanned the area carefully, making sure no guards were nearby. Satisfied that the coast was clear, he began working on the crates. Using tools scavenged earlier, he rigged the explosives to detonate remotely. It wasn't perfect. His hands trembled slightly from pain and exhaustion, but it would work. All he needed was a trigger mechanism. He found what he needed in a discarded piece of alien tech, a small control panel with a damaged interface. With some quick adjustments, he managed to rig it to activate the explosives. He tested it once, ensuring it worked, then tucked it into his pocket. Now all he had to do was get back to Rachel and Daniel before the Vryn realized what was happening. But as he turned to leave, he froze. A pair of glowing eyes stared back at him from the shadows. One of the Vryn soldiers had spotted him. It hissed angrily, its claws flexing as it prepared to strike. Ethan reacted instantly, hurling one of his improvised weapons with surprising accuracy. The shard struck the Vryn in the shoulder, causing it to stagger back. But it didn't fall. Instead, it lunged forward faster than Ethan expected. He barely managed to dodge, rolling awkwardly to avoid its claws. Pain shot through his leg, but he forced himself to focus. He grabbed another shard and swung it like a knife, slashing at the Vryn's exposed throat. The creature screeched and stumbled, giving Ethan just enough time to scramble away. He limped toward the nearest tree, using it as cover while he caught his breath. The Vryn followed, its glowing eyes locked onto him. "Ethan," Rachel's voice called out from somewhere nearby. Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't risk drawing her into the fight. Instead, he waited until the Vryn was close enough, then hurled his last improvised weapon with all his strength. It struck, true, sinking deep into the creature's chest. This time it fell, twitching briefly before going still. Rachel appeared moments later, her sidearm raised. "Are you okay?" she asked urgently. "I'm fine," Ethan muttered, though his face was pale and sweat dripped from his brow. "Did you clear the path?" "We did," Rachel replied. "But we need to move. More are coming." Ethan nodded and gestured toward the rigged explosives. "I set them up. We just need to get far enough away to trigger them." Rachel helped him to his feet, and together they rejoined Daniel, who was waiting anxiously nearby. "What now?" Daniel asked. "Now we run," Ethan said simply. They moved as quickly as they could, putting as much distance between themselves and the command post as possible. Ethan's leg burned with every step, but he pushed through the pain, knowing they couldn't afford to stop. Behind them, the distant hum of Vryn communication devices grew louder. The enemy was regrouping, closing in. Finally, they reached a safe distance, or as safe as they could hope for. Ethan pulled out the control panel and studied it briefly. "This should do it," he said, pressing the activation button. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deafening roar, the command post erupted in a massive explosion. The shockwave knocked the three humans off their feet, sending waves of heat and debris flying in every direction. The glow of the structure disappeared, replaced by a towering column of smoke and fire. Rachel coughed as she climbed to her feet, shielding her face from the falling ash. "Did we get them?" she asked. Ethan nodded weakly. "That should scatter their forces. Without a command center, they'll be disorganized, at least for a while." Daniel looked at the destruction in awe. "That was intense. It's not over yet," Rachel reminded them. "We still need to get back to Captain Drake." Ethan struggled to stand, leaning heavily on Rachel for support. "Let's move," We've done our part. Now it's up to the others to finish the job. They began making their way back toward the human forces, their pace slow but steady. The forest around them felt eerily quiet now, the chaos of the explosion having driven most of the wildlife, and the Vryn, into hiding. For the first time, in hours, Ethan allowed himself a small measure of hope. They had struck a blow against the enemy, one that might turn the tide of the battle. But he knew better than to let his guard down. The Vryn weren't defeated yet, and even a wounded enemy could still fight back. As they walked, Ethan kept his makeshift weapon ready, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Behind them, the smoke from the destroyed command post rose high into the sky, a silent testament to their bravery and their desperation. The war wasn't over, but for now humanity had a fighting chance. The journey back to the human forces was long and grueling. Ethan's leg had worsened, the pain now a constant burning ache that made every step feel like walking on fire. Rachel stayed close to him, her arm wrapped firmly around his waist to keep him upright. Daniel walked ahead, keeping watch for any signs of danger. The forest seemed quieter than before, but none of them trusted the silence. They knew the Vryn were still out there, regrouping and searching for whoever had destroyed their command post. Ethan's mind raced as they moved. He replayed the explosion in his head, the deafening roar, the heat, the chaos. It had been risky, reckless even, but it had worked. The Vryn's leadership structure was shattered, at least temporarily. Without their command center, their attacks would be less coordinated, giving Captain Drake and the rest of the human forces a chance to regroup and strike back. But Ethan also knew they weren't safe yet. The Vryn were relentless. Even without their leaders, they would fight fiercely to reclaim the ground they had lost, and if they discovered who was responsible for the destruction of their command post, Ethan pushed the thought aside. There was no point in worrying about what might happen. All they could do was keep moving and hope they reached friendly lines before the enemy caught up with them. "Do you think they know it was us?" Daniel asked suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was low but carried a note of fear. Ethan shook his head. "Hard to say. They're smart, but they don't know our movements. As long as we stay quiet and keep moving, we might have a shot at making it back." Rachel glanced over her shoulder, scanning the trees behind them. "Even if they don't know it was us, they'll be looking for survivors. If they find us, we won't last long." "We'll make it," Ethan said firmly, though his voice betrayed the strain he was under. "We've come this far. We're not stopping now." Daniel nodded, though his expression remained uneasy. He adjusted his grip on his rifle, his eyes darting nervously toward every shadow and rustling leaf. The boy was young, too young, Ethan thought bitterly, but he had held his own so far. Still, Ethan couldn't help but worry. If they ran into more Vryn, Daniel might not survive another fight. They pressed on, their pace slow but steady. The neon lights of the forest dimmed further as night fell, casting the world in shades of gray and black. It made navigation harder, but it also provided better cover. Ethan, Rachel, and Daniel moved cautiously, avoiding open areas and sticking to the densest patches of foliage. After what felt like hours, they finally reached the edge of the forest. Beyond the trees, the landscape opened up into a rocky plain littered with the wreckage of battle. The remains of human and Vryn vehicles lay scattered across the ground, their twisted metal frames glowing faintly in the moonlight. In the distance, Ethan could see the faint outline of a ridge. That was where Captain Drake and the remnants of the human forces were supposed to be regrouping. "We're almost there," Rachel said softly, her voice tinged with relief. "Just a little farther." Ethan nodded, though his body screamed in protest. Every muscle in his leg felt like it was on fire, and his vision blurred slightly from exhaustion. He clenched his jaw and forced himself to focus. He couldn't afford to collapse now, not when they were so close. As they stepped out of the forest, a sudden sound froze them in place. It was faint, but unmistakable, the hum of Vryn communication devices. Ethan's heart sank. They weren't alone. "Get down!" Rachel hissed, pulling Ethan to the ground. Daniel dropped beside them. his rifle raised as he scanned the area. From the shadows of the wreckage, 3 Vryn soldiers emerged, their glowing eyes scanning the darkness. They moved cautiously, their claws flexing as they searched for movement. Ethan held his breath, pressing himself flat against the cold, rocky ground. His makeshift weapon was still clutched in his hand, but he knew it wouldn't be enough if the Vryn found them. Rachel slowly reached for her sidearm, her movements deliberate and silent. She glanced at Ethan, then at Daniel, signaling them to stay still. The Vryn were close now, their insect-like bodies casting strange shadows in the dim light. One of them paused, its head tilting as if sensing something. "They're going to find us," Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. "Not if we act first," Rachel replied under her breath. Before Ethan could stop her, she rolled onto her side and fired. The shot hit one of the Vryn squarely in the chest, causing it to stagger backward. Its companions reacted instantly, charging toward the source of the attack. "Move!" Rachel shouted, scrambling to her feet. Ethan and Daniel followed, limping and stumbling as they tried to put distance between themselves and the Vryn. The 2 remaining aliens were fast, their sleek bodies weaving through the wreckage with terrifying speed. Ethan turned, hurling his improvised weapon with all the strength he had left. It struck one of the Vryn in the face, causing it to screech in pain and falter. Daniel fired his rifle, hitting the second creature in the leg. It stumbled but didn't fall, its claws slashing wildly as it closed the gap. Rachel fired again, taking down the injured Vryn with a clean shot to the head. The last one lunged at her, its claws aimed directly at her throat. She ducked just in time, the creature's claws grazing her shoulder. She spun around, firing point blank into its glowing eyes. It collapsed with a final guttural hiss. For a moment there was silence. Then Rachel let out a shaky breath, lowering her weapon. Her shoulder was bleeding, but she ignored it, turning to check on Ethan and Daniel. "Are you both okay?" "I'm fine," Daniel muttered, though his hands were trembling as he reloaded his rifle. Ethan nodded weakly, leaning heavily on his makeshift crutch. "We need to keep moving. More will come." Rachel didn't argue. She helped Ethan to his feet, and together they began crossing the rocky plain. The ridge was closer now, its silhouette clear against the night sky. Lights flickered faintly along its crest. Human lights. They were almost there. As they neared the base of the ridge, a figure appeared from the shadows. It was a human soldier, his uniform torn but his weapon steady. "Who goes there?" he called out, his voice sharp and wary. "It's us," Rachel shouted back, raising her hands to show she wasn't a threat. "We're with Captain Drake." The soldier hesitated, then lowered his weapon. "You're lucky we spotted you. The Vryn have been sweeping this area for hours." "We know," Ethan said grimly. "Is the captain here?" The soldier nodded. "He's setting up defenses further up the ridge. Follow me." They climbed the ridge slowly, their bodies exhausted but their spirits lifted by the sight of other humans. When they reached the top, they were greeted by a scene of organized chaos. Soldiers worked quickly to fortify their position, setting up barricades and tending to the wounded. In the center of it all stood Captain Drake, his face streaked with dirt but his eyes sharp and focused. "Report," he said as Rachel and the others approached. Rachel saluted briefly, then launched into an explanation of what had happened: the ambush, the traps, the destruction of the Vryn command post. Drake listened intently, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "You did good," he said finally. "Real good. That command post was their main hub. Without it, their forces are scattered. We can use that to our advantage." "What's the plan, sir?" Rachel asked. Drake gestured toward the ridge. "We hold this position. The Vryn will come at us hard, but if we can hold them off until reinforcements arrive, we might just win this fight." Ethan frowned. "Reinforcements, are they coming?" "They are," Drake replied. "But they won't get here in time unless we buy them some breathing room. That means holding the line, at any cost." Ethan exchanged a glance with Rachel. He knew what that meant. This wasn't over yet. The battle was far from won and the cost would likely be high, but they had no choice. Humanity's survival depended on it. "We'll do whatever it takes," Ethan said firmly. Drake nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. I know you will. Get some rest while you can. We'll need everyone ready when the fighting starts again. As the others dispersed, Ethan leaned against a rock, closing his eyes for a moment. His body ached, and his mind was heavy with exhaustion, but he couldn't stop now. Not when there was still work to be done. Rachel sat beside him, her shoulder, bandaged but otherwise unharmed. You should rest, she said quietly. You've done enough. Ethan shook his head. Not yet. There's still too much to do. Rachel didn't argue. She simply nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Beyond the ridge, the glow of the Vryn's forces could be seen in the distance. They were coming. The night stretched on, endless and cold. Ethan sat near the edge of the ridge, his makeshift weapon resting across his knees. His leg throbbed with every heartbeat, but he ignored the pain, focusing instead on the distant glow of the Vryn forces. They were moving closer, their numbers vast and their movements deliberate. The humans had bought themselves some time, but it wouldn't last long. Rachel approached quietly, handing him a canteen. Drink, she said firmly. You're no good to anyone if you collapse. Ethan took the canteen with a faint smile. Thanks. He sipped slowly, the cool water soothing his dry throat. For a moment, the two of them sat in silence, watching as the horizon lit up with flashes of light, Vryn patrols testing the human defenses. They're probing us, Rachel said finally, breaking the quiet. Trying to find weak spots. They won't find any, Ethan replied. Not while Captain Drake's in charge. Rachel nodded, though her expression remained tense. Still, we're outnumbered. If they break through. They won't, Ethan interrupted. His voice was firm, almost defiant. We've come too far to let that happen. Rachel studied him for a moment, then smiled faintly. You're stubborn, you know that? It's kept me alive this long, Ethan muttered. He glanced at her shoulder, still bandaged from the earlier fight. How's your arm? It's fine, Rachel said dismissively. Just a scratch. I'll live. Ethan didn't press the issue. Instead, he turned his attention back to the battlefield. The humans had fortified their position well, using the wreckage of vehicles and fallen trees to create makeshift barricades. Soldiers moved between them, checking weapons and exchanging quiet words of encouragement. Despite the odds, there was a sense of determination in the air, a refusal to give up no matter how bleak things seemed. Captain Drake stood at the center of it all, barking orders and rallying his troops. His voice carried over the ridge, steady and commanding. Hold the line, he shouted. Remember why we're here. We fight for humanity. For Earth. The soldiers responded with shouts of agreement, their morale boosted by his words. Ethan felt a flicker of pride despite the grim reality of their situation. These people weren't just soldiers. They were survivors, willing to risk everything to protect what mattered most. As dawn began to break, the first wave of Vryn attacked. They came in fast, their sleek bodies weaving through the rocky terrain, with terrifying speed. The humans opened fire immediately, their weapons lighting up the early morning sky. Explosions rocked the ground as grenades detonated, sending shards of metal flying in every direction. The air was filled with the sound of gunfire, screams, and the screeches of the alien invaders. Ethan stayed low, using his sniper training to pick off key targets from his position on the ridge. His makeshift weapon wasn't perfect, but it was enough to take out several Vryn soldiers before they could reach the barricades. Each shot was calculated, precise, a testament to his skill even under such dire circumstances. Rachel fought alongside the others, her sidearm blazing as she took down enemy after enemy. Her movements were fluid and efficient, born of years of combat experience. Daniel stayed close to her, his rifle steady as he provided covering fire. Together, they formed a small but effective team, holding their section of the line against overwhelming odds. The battle raged for hours, neither side gaining a clear advantage. The humans' defenses held strong, but the Vryn kept coming. their sheer numbers threatening to overwhelm the defenders. Casualties mounted on both sides, and the smell of smoke and blood filled the air. Ethan's strength was fading. His injured leg made it hard to move quickly, and his arms trembled from the effort of holding his weapon steady. Still, he refused to stop. Every shot he fired bought his comrades precious seconds, and every second counted. Then, something changed. A loud rumble echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing moment. Ethan looked up, squinting against the rising sun. At first, he couldn't make out what it was. Then he saw them, human reinforcements, arriving in dropships that descended from the sky like angels of salvation. Their arrival was accompanied by a barrage of artillery fire, targeting the Vryn forces and scattering them across the battlefield. The tide of the battle shifted instantly. The Vryn, caught off guard by the sudden assault, began to retreat. Their once coordinated attacks dissolved into chaos as they tried to regroup. Captain Drake seized the opportunity, ordering his troops to push forward and reclaim lost ground. "This is it," Drake shouted, his voice filled with urgency. "Push them back! Don't let them recover!" The humans charged forward, their spirits lifted by the arrival of reinforcements. Ethan limped along with them, his weapon ready despite his exhaustion. Rachel stayed close, her eyes scanning the battlefield for threats. Daniel followed behind, his rifle aimed steadily at the retreating Vryn. The fighting continued, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Vryn were beaten, their forces shattered by the combined efforts of the human defenders and the newly arrived reinforcements. By mid-morning, the battle was over. The remaining Vryn fled, disappearing into the forest from which they had come. Exhausted but victorious, the humans gathered on the ridge, tending to their wounded and counting their losses. Captain Drake addressed the survivors, his voice heavy with emotion. "Today we proved something important," he said. "We proved that no matter how tough the fight, no matter how bad the odds, humanity doesn't give up. You all fought bravely, and because of that we survived." The soldiers cheered, their voices echoing across the battlefield. Ethan leaned against a rock, his body trembling with fatigue. Rachel sat beside him, her head bowed as she caught her breath. Daniel joined them a moment later, his face pale but his expression proud. "You did it," Rachel said softly, looking at Ethan. "You turned the tide." Ethan shook his head. "We did it. All of us." Rachel smiled faintly. "Still, you started it. Without your traps, your plan, none of this would have happened." Ethan didn't respond. He simply stared out at the battlefield, his mind heavy with thoughts of those who hadn't made it. The victory was bittersweet, tempered by the cost of lives lost. But it was a victory nonetheless, one that gave humanity a fighting chance to survive. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its golden light over the wreckage and the weary survivors, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. The war wasn't over, but they had won this battle. And sometimes, winning one battle was enough to keep going.